The first modern MMA fighter and the first modern MMA coach has to be Carlson Gracie Sr. when he was living in Brazil. Carlson fought Vale Tudo, no holds barred, 18 times, and I believe he won 17 of those 18 matches. He opened up jiu-jitsu to the masses. Before Carlson, jiu-jitsu was mostly taught in small private classes, one-on-one, and then the Gracie family would do some sparring at the end of the day or some private training. But in terms of spreading it far and wide, that was Carlson. Also, after Royce Gracie won UFC 1 and 2 and did well in the early UFCs, it was Carlson's guys who went on to dominate in Pride and dominate in many other MMA organizations, including the MMA organizations that sprang up again in Brazil. The chances are very strong that your jiu-jitsu lineage is connected to Carlson's lineage, either through Carlson or through Halls Gracie, because Carlson and Halls taught together at an academy in Rio for a while and were kind of intertwined. They were kind of frenemies, they were kind of rivals, but they did work together and had similar approaches. So here are 7 things that Robert Drysdale identified that we take for granted now that were not at all taken for granted back then. They were not self-evident. So number 1, Carlson preferred to fight MMA without the gi, and he preferred training for his MMA fights without the gi. This is a radical idea. Recall that Royce was wearing a gi when he fought in UFC 1. That's because his lineage came more through the Gracie Academy. Carlson, who'd already been fighting for years and was retired by the time that Royce came out, advocated Nogi Training and Nogi fighting, and that was radical for the time. Number 2, Carlson advocated being very well-rounded and cross-training and making sure that all areas of your game were covered. He advocated fighting from the top, knowing how to survive on the bottom, doing boxing, doing judo, doing wrestling, having all these different areas that you train in, not just a classical Brazilian jiu-jitsu or a Gracie jiu-jitsu. Related to that, number 3, he advocated for knowing takedowns. It's one thing to be able to hold somebody down once you've fallen over, but it's an entirely different thing to get them down to the ground in the first place. And it was Carlson who really placed this initial emphasis on takedowns. Number 4, that ground and pound is a valid way to win. That beating somebody until they give up or beating somebody until they get unconscious when you're on top of them on the ground is just as valid a way to win by submission, and you'd be a fool to ignore it. It really does seem, when you look through the records of the older fights that happened before Carlson, that most of the times the Gracies were only going for submissions. As a result, they had a ton of draws when they couldn't submit their opponent. It doesn't mean that going for a submission is a bad thing, but Carlson introduced the idea that, well, it's a valid idea to pound somebody into oblivion too in an MMA fight. Related to that, the next point is that all things being equal, it's better to be on top than on bottom in an MMA fight. Again, this may seem totally self-evident to us today, but it wasn't then. If you're on top, if you're able to put weight on a guy, if you're able to punch him, this is a much better position to win a real fight from than from the bottom. And I think this has been borne out by countless analyses of MMA fights. Yes, it's possible to win a fight from the bottom, much better to be on top. Number 6, Carlson believed that strength and athleticism were both as important as technique and also didn't detract from technique. There's an idea in some traditional martial arts circles that, if you use strength, if you use athleticism, then you're not going to be using technique. I don't think this is the dichotomy in Carlson's world. He believed in strength and athleticism and technique. And again, if you take a look at modern MMA fighters, they're all doing conditioning, they're all strong, they're all athletic, and they all have good technique, at least at the higher levels. And number 7, and this is mind-blowing, before Carlson, there was very little live sparring. It seems like most of the teaching of the populace anyway, you had to be rich, you had to take a ton of private classes, and then maybe you do a little bit of rolling, but most of it was kind of like kata. Okay, here's technique number 1, here's technique number 2. It was from a self-defense point of view, it was teaching techniques, and if there was any live rolling, it wasn't emphasized. Carlson, when he opened his school, had live rolling, invited everybody in, cherry-picked the biggest, the baddest guys, put them all in a room, let them fight it out, basically get as much experience as you can against as wide a variety of people as you can, under pressure against real resistance. We take this for granted, at least most of us do. If you go to an open mat today, or if at the end of class, your professor says, okay, time for sparring, this is a Carlson Gracie innovation. This was not typically done. But how do you get good? You get good by training against live resistance, against as many different people as you can, so you can experience as much as you can. And do you know who formulated those 7 points really nicely? Robert Drysdale in his new book, The Rise and Evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a fantastic book. There's so much information in here, so many historical interviews, so many really cool historical photos. My favorite is a photo of Carlson doing an omoplata. Looks like in an MMA match in like the 1950s. That's cool. I love the omoplata. I'm going to be having Robert on my podcast, the Strenuous Life Podcast, real soon to talk about this book, to talk about the evolution and the rise of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in much more detail. Good luck with your training.